Thank you, thank you. It's a delight to be here. It's a delight to see such a nice crowd. If I do run into trouble in Texas, I'm moving here. But it is really nice to see such a nice welcome and the applause. You know, I get up and speak on occasion in Washington, and I never get any applause. So it's very nice to be here. It's very nice here. And I do want to recognize that I got to say hello to Merrill Cook, my former colleague, and he spent some time over there in Washington. It was good to see him. Today also I got to have lunch with a former colleague that I was in Congress with in the first tour of duty, and that was Norm Shumway, who's now, lives in your town, but he was a representative from California back in that time. But I do want to especially recognize the two co-sponsors, Senator Thomas and Representative Bush, and I'm delighted that they are supporting this and leading the charge in this state. So it is a real pleasure to be with so many friends and colleagues, and this to me really gives a lot of hope. Because when you're in Washington and spend time there and come up on the short end of most of the votes, it could be discouraging. It really doesn't bother me that much. A lot of people ask me, how can you stand it? Don't you get really discouraged by what's going on? And I say, no, not really. I just don't have high expectations for what's going on in Washington. And in a way, you have to sort of have a thick skin about it, because if you go with the expectation, or if we all do our daily activities, believing that tomorrow we're going to correct all the problems we have, you will get a little frustrated, because we know it doesn't work that way. But without the grassroots effort that's occurring in organizations like this, there is no hope. There's a difference in the way I see things from the 1970s and the early 1980s, having been in Congress, and now that I've been back in the late 1990s and this early part of this century. And Washington itself is not a lot different. I mean, they're the same arguments, the same backdoor deals, and same spending, same deficits. Everything seems to go on, and at times it even seems worse. But I believe there's really reason to be optimistic. I think things have improved a lot around the country. I, for one, would predict that maybe if I had been invited in 1978 or 79 to come here, there might not be as much interest as there is today. So I think something is happening in the country. And there's reason to be optimistic, because in the 70s, we had 3 major networks to deal with, and that was it. And we knew where they were coming from. But boy, now we have 5 majors, and now we have 5 majors to worry about. But no, there's a lot more opportunity. There's cable television, but the explosion in the use of putting out information on the internet, to me, is just fantastic. And radio, talk shows, and talk show hosts around the country, I just think it's dramatic what's happening, and people are learning and being able to coordinate and organize. And so there's every reason to believe that technology and the modern things of today actually are helping us, who are, we have to admit it, in a minority viewpoint. And at least it hasn't been offered very generously to the American people. I'm optimistic enough to believe that when we do offer it, it does become the majority opinion. And that's what, of course, has been my goal. So I personally was very, very happy with what has happened in Texas. I mean, this is a real delight, because my goal has always been to state the position, stand by it, stand up for the Constitution, and not waver, but still get support. And I think that's key to it. So therefore, at the beginning, the first year I was brought back into Congress in 97, I had 51% of the vote. 96 election came in 97. And that was a narrow victory, and it was a Democratic-leaning district. And each time it went up 5 or 10 points. Even last time we had 68% of the vote. So we were very pleased that everybody knew how I was voting, and they knew my positions, and they weren't, using it against me. It was actually had become a positive. And it was well advertised. If I voted by myself, which I tend to have a habit of doing that if because if I think they're doing something that's not explicitly expressed in the Constitution, I think the vote should be no. But I did get concerned about redistricting. You probably have heard about the redistricting in Texas. It was a major event. It was a very, very partisan event, which doesn't necessarily mean it's a philosophic event, but very, very partisan. And the leadership there were very tough and negotiated, and it was true. It's a Republican state, and yet the Democrats had 17 seats to 13 Republicans. Republican. So just out of fairness, the argument should be that the redistricting should go through. But it was a long, tough battle, and it was just concluded here just weeks ago. And it went through the courts, and it was a real struggle. But I was concerned because I thought, well, I'm probably not going to get the best Republican district in Texas either. And I didn't. I didn't get the best one. I got the 22nd worst one. So I had the lowest number of Republicans in my district. So boy, you know, we got concerned. I thought, how are we going to do this? What kind of opposition? 300,000 new constituents out of 600,000. And I picked up the city of Galveston, which is a very liberal city. And I thought that we might have a real challenger. So I was a bit concerned about it. But lo and behold, exactly as was mentioned in the introduction, a Republican didn't feel that that they should run against me, and then a Democrat didn't file. But it just happens that there are, out of the 32 seats in Texas, there are 31 Libertarian candidates in the district running there. So my Libertarian friends, saw to it that we wouldn't have to deal with that, which I think goes to prove that the philosophy of the Founding Fathers and the philosophy of the Constitution, when it's presented to the people, is a popular position. And it isn't the majority position because it's not offered enough. And that is why I am quite willing to travel and come around and visit with groups like this and encourage all your efforts, because this is so important. Because I believe when the people do know and find out, they will support these views. And that's one thing that we should be very, very happy about. You know, there was one, I think it was the Congressional Quarter, they gave me some type of award because they did add up the number of votes that I voted by myself. And it turned out that I voted by myself more time than everybody else put together. But there was one vote, and I am sure there'll be somebody in this room that probably disagree with me on this one, but the way I looked at it, I thought it was a no vote. And that had to do with the government making a list. If you want to call up, and maybe some of you have already done it, call up and get on a list and say, do not call me for advertisements. You know, and my wife, she said, why wouldn't you vote for that? She's sick of those calls. Well, you know, I had my constitutional reason. I thought, well, we didn't need another government list, you know, and besides, why don't you just hang up or do something else, you know? And there's technology available. There's a lot of arguments against that. But then, anyway, there was a cartoon out recently, and I thought it was pretty appropriate. And the cartoon expressed a desire, which I think expresses my desire. And it was talking to the government. It says, put me on the do not wiretap me list. Now, the sad part is we all should have been on that do not wiretap me list automatically with our Constitution. But unfortunately, we've all been put on that list with legislation passed like the Patriot Act, and that's something we better stay concerned about. You know, the language in Washington you have to worry about. You have to understand language, and I think some of the warnings in 1984 are very appropriate. But there's been a quote going that was published not too long ago from our Secretary of Defense. And I think this tells you a little bit about the language and how people talk in Washington. So this is what our secretary said. He says, reports that say something hasn't happened are always interesting to me because, as we know, there are known knowns there are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know, we don't know. So if you want clarification, just come to Washington and we'll fix it up for you. We have a special 1984 language over there that we can use. But the subject, of course, tonight is United Nations. I will spend a fair amount of time on that, but I do want to start off by talking a little bit about the Patriot Act, because sovereignty, which is the issue of the United Nations, is not so narrowly defined by me as just international government. I start with sovereignty of the individual and your obligations and responsibilities as a person and your natural right to your life and your liberty. So it is our sovereign rights to ourselves, and we receive this from our Creator. That obligation, I think, is very clear. And then it goes up the ladder, and for me, I see government as to be very limited to protect that right of your life and your responsibility, and for government to restrain the interference with those rights, the interference with anybody injuring you or destroying your property, and really not much, heck of a lot more from government. So whether it's the overburden of even a state government, or even a local government, or a federal government, or whether it's an international government, it's all an attack on sovereignty. But of course, the biggest, one of the biggest concerns we ought to have now, and the reason why meetings like this are important, is to alert the people to the serious attack on our sovereignty by international government, and a lot of people haven't heard about that. They do know about local regulations, state regulations, and federal government regulations, and courts and bureaucrats and all that, but they're not quite as aware of what's happening at the federal level. But anyway, a lot has happened in Washington. A lot has changed in attitude in passage of legislation since 9/11, and obviously so, and justifiably. But in the atmosphere following 9/11, the attitude was pass anything, quickly do something, because the people want something done, which that attitude I did not share. Matter of fact, coming out of 9/11 has been this move, and I am sure a lot of people in this audience are quite aware of it, and that is the continuation of government movement, and that is to allow our state governors to appoint congressmen rather than have them elected. And they said, and one of the reasons they argue this case is, well, we need people there immediately so that they can start passing legislation. And I said, well, that's a pretty good reason not to do it. Because sitting back and thinking about it might not hurt anything, and certainly we should have been more thoughtful immediately after 9/11. But within weeks, it was not very long that the Patriot Act was passed and put into law, and I know there's a lot of discussion of that since then, and a lot of grassroots resistance to it. But that bill was brought up very rapidly. The rules were bent. The bill wasn't available to us even to read, and there are a lot of changes in there. The major change, of course, is the attack on the Fourth Amendment. And the other thing you ought to know is that much of has been put in the Patriot Act was already planned. They have had this legislation around. They were trying to get these powers and authority all along, and they just dumped them in, and they were able to get them passed. But you know, after the discussion occurred in the last year or so on talk shows and on the internet and all around the country, the grassroots must have done a good job, because the members of Congress were getting enough messages, you know, go slow on this. And so there was an amendment I was a co-author of with Butch Otter, and we amended the Patriot Act in the House last fall. And that was to at least strike the one provision for the sneak and peek provisions. and that is for our government not to be able to come into our house without a search warrant, sneak, look around, and just searching for something and not even have to tell anybody what was going on and tell a judge within 30 days. It's just a monstrous portion of the bill. But we brought that up and had a vote on it, and the vote was over 300 members voted to repeal that. So we were very, very encouraged. Two things. One, when the people hear about it and wake up, they come down with good sense and they get the message to their members of Congress, and the members of Congress respond properly. But the bad thing about it is when that bill got into conference, it was just quietly removed. So it did not become the law of the land. So the establishment got to keep it in, and the people who worked so hard and got their members of Congress to vote the right way, we lost. Not only did we lose on weakening the Patriot Act, when we had the Intelligence Appropriation Bill, which is the CIA money, which is very secretive, which in a truly free and open society we wouldn't have, and we're not even sure how much money it is and where it goes. It's over $40 billion. Well, inside that bill was a provision to introduce part of Patriot Act number 2. And lo and behold, that got passed and signed into law. So that's why our job is so tough. So when we do rally the people and the people respond and even the members of Congress get the message and they vote a certain way, then it is our vigilance that makes the difference. Can we follow through and watch and see what happens and read the bill after it comes out of conference? Most bills aren't read when they come out of conference, and that's where all the dirty work is done. You think when you debate it on the House floor and the committees, that's just for the public to hear it, and get a little bit off our chest. And then ultimately, though, those who want certain things will put it into the conference bill, and then when they vote on the conference bill, there's usually an hour debate on the conference bill up and down, and very, very rarely does a conference bill get voted down. But that's why we continue to do bad things, and in spite of the efforts that the people make in expressing themselves, I don't say that to discourage you. I tell you that to be realistic and realize how persistent one has to be in order to make these changes. And let me tell you, your efforts and your messages and your talking in your organizations like this have an effect, because that's where a lot of individuals in Washington get their information. And they're not usually as philosophically concerned. What they are is they like their job, and they will, which is a half a good. You'd wish they were very, very philosophically and very committed and very much in our camp. But in the other sense is, if we express ourselves, which is the usual way it happens, is when the people express themselves, that the Congress will respond, and if that is the case, that is very good. So that means that our efforts will have an effect. So you can't be too discouraged by saying, boy, I just sort of wished he was an automatic and he knows what it is. It means that our job is worthwhile, and you have to continue with this effort. Also, in the area of sovereignty, and this gets a little bit closer to the United Nations, and that has to do with legislation that we passed in October of 2002. And that was the legislation that transferred congressional authority to the president to go to war. And this piece of legislation I was strongly opposed to. There are two issues involved. One, we are in war. We can't deny it. The way we go to war and whether or not the war is wise or not. I happen to think the war has not been a wise constitutional defensive war, so therefore I've been opposed to it, and there's room. But the other side of the coin is, how do you do it? Now, this is one thing that the founders were very, very clear on, is that we as a people would only go to war when the people's opinions were expressed through the members of Congress. And that is a declaration of war by the members of Congress, and that should be the only way we go to war. Now, if you think about it, there's a bad record since we quit doing it. We quit declaring war in 1941. We haven't declared it since. But we do know that we won that war, clearly, in 1945. And yet, since then, have we had crystal clear victories? I guess you could. You could pick up a few skirmishes here and there that you could call crystal clear. But I wouldn't be too much bragging about the Korean War, and we're still going with that one. We've spent over $1 trillion over there, and now we're still worried about the North Vietnamese threatening us. And of course, Vietnam was a political black mark, and to think of the loss of lives, not only the 60,000 men that died, but the ones that have been wounded and maimed and sick and died ever since, and they get forgotten. And so many veterans get forgotten. We're so much more interested in creating new wounded veterans, and we forget about the ones that had to suffer and don't get the right treatment back home. But since that time, we have, of course, fought a Cold War with a lot of hot spots in it, hundreds of thousands of men killed, and tens of hundreds of thousands wounded and injured over these many decades. In a way, the Persian Gulf War has been just one war. We went to war in 1991. And I remember very clearly then, I was not in office, didn't vote on it, but I did not like the process then. And the one statement I remember, the president at that time said that he was being pressured, public pressure was put on him to come to the Congress to get some type of a resolution to endorse the war. And he said, no, he didn't want to. Oh, okay, I'll do it. But let me tell you, he says, regardless of what the Congress says, we're going because I got the resolution from the United Nations. But the Congress did. It was not an overwhelming margin, and it wasn't a declaration of war, but it endorsed allowing the president to go into this war to fight for UN resolutions. It could not be argued that it had any direct threat to our national security, and if you study that history, it's very, very controversial of all the public arguments made for the necessity of going to war then. And of course, that war has continued. The bombing has continued, and the embargoes and the killing, and that has continued throughout that until, of course, now we've had this new outbreak and a new burden, a new problem, and still a lot of men getting killed, and we don't know when it's going to end. It's not going to end in July, and it may be, they admit it could be 5 or 10 years. It can go on and on. But again, I think the argument goes back to why are we fighting these wars, and why don't we declare war? Now, if we need to, when that resolution came to international relations, the committee that I'm on, just to make the point that I'm making to you is, I substituted the amendment they had up there, and I substituted a declaration of war. It's very simple. It's three lines long, and I copied it from World War II. And I told them at the time, I said, you're going to have to make sure this is defeated because I'm going to vote against my amendment. But this is what you should do if you want to go to war. And then, of course, they didn't like to vote on it, and they didn't like what I was going to do. And of course, nobody voted for it. But instead, they passed a resolution which transferred the power to go to war at will to the president. But I want to read to you what the chairman of the committee said immediately after I introduced my resolution. And his statement was this. He says, and he was, putting me down. He says, there are things in the Constitution that have been overtaken by events, by time. Declaration of war is one of them. There are things no longer relevant to a modern society. Why declare war if you don't have to? We are saying to the president, use your judgment. So, to demand that we declare war is to strengthen something to death. You have got a hammerlock on this situation, and it's not called for. inappropriate, anachronistic. It isn't done anymore. So that tells you, the chairman of the committee is telling me that our Constitution is anachronistic, is a waste of time, and then the Democrat minority leader in the committee said, gave a similar talk, and his strongest word was, what you're doing, Paul, is frivolous. So this is what we're up against. But again, my strength doesn't come from them. It comes from you and the people who care, about our Constitution. In that resolution, they never mention Article 1, Section 8 in Declaration of War. That was totally ignored. But they mention the United Nations 21 times in that transfer of power. At the same time, and within those months that followed, we did hear in the public a fair amount of criticism about the UN. The criticism about the UN wasn't, joining on, and they didn't. The UN did not respond as our administration wanted them to. But it could have been interpreted that this was a strong attack on the United Nations. It wasn't so much that as a challenge to the United Nations to be stronger and more forceful and let us control the United Nations, because still we use the United Nations. Even at the State of the Union message, if you listen carefully, it was mentioned 4 times when he talked about the war, and he talked about the United Nations and upholding these resolutions. So we do know that the opposition to the United Nations is not that strong, even though you might hear some comments coming from our leadership. The leadership tends to think that it should be strengthened as long as it goes our way. We can have an international criminal court, so if we get exempted for a few more years, that's going to be okay. But that is not a good, healthy way to do it. In the meantime, what has happened? We have rejoined UNESCO, which we should not have. We should not have rejoined UNESCO, which means a lot more money to the United Nations. We are still paying far beyond our fair share at the United Nations. So we get stuck with the responsibility and all the financing and the burden and the men lost too often. And I think that of all the things that we should be concerned about from the United Nations, and the damage that is done to us and the potential damage that is likely to come, I would say that the greatest threat is that we have, over these years, been willing to turn over to the United Nations much of the control of our foreign policy, and when we go to war, and that has to be changed. But the United Nations has been a burden in other areas as well, and it's always looking for new angles. The United Nations has already introduced the notion and made proposals of having a world tax. They would like to tax financial transactions and start raising money. Small amounts, and you and I probably wouldn't have to pay immediately, but the principle is 100%, and that means, is there a world government strong enough to introduce the idea that there will be a world tax to start managing this government? Very, very dangerous, and that idea is floating around. It's not implemented, but someday it may well be implemented. There's another provision and proposal that they're working on, and that is for our rights as American citizens to be armed and defend ourselves will no longer be honored, but will be controlled by UN resolutions. I have a bill in the Congress already, although that has not been implemented yet or forced upon us. I have a bill that, if passed, would deny any money at all, not 1 cent could be spent in enforcing that type of a resolution to undermine our Second Amendment. But there's the Kyoto-type treaties that want to introduce the idea of total land control, the idea of these heritage sites. These are all examples of incrementalism where they move in. It doesn't seem to be a big deal, but it's always setting the stage and the principle. And of course, that's the way the income tax started. Just a few of the rich people would pay a little bit, percent here, percent there, but lo and behold, we end up with the monstrous tax code that we have today. So not only should you look at how we might be suffering from what the UN is doing right now, we have to look at it on principle, on whether or not it is legal under our Constitution to give this authority to the United Nations, and if it's not to let them have the inch, because they will take a mile and they should not be given that inch at all. Today there was, on the front page of your paper today, there was an announcement that the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the EPA regulations. It said the EPA regulations supersede the state of Alaska in whether or not they were allowed to have a generator. And the EPA said it was a dirty generator. I don't even know if it was a dirty generator. It may well be, and may not be in production. It maybe shouldn't be. It might be for the best of that state and the surrounding people. In a free society, in a constitutional society, nobody has a right to pollute their neighbor's property. But that doesn't mean we have to wholesale endorse the notion of the EPA in Washington. It doesn't happen. But here it was saying that the EPA, has the authority to do this and keep the state of Alaska from saying anything. Under the original Constitution, those were state matters and they should have been dealt with at the state level. And there's an agreement that we have signed with the United Nations, and it is another one dealing with the environment, and it deals with this persistent organic pollutant. They call it a POPs agreement. And this agreement, and although the president has signed it, legislation has to be passed, and they're trying to pass it this year to get to make it legal, where the EPA is the only one that has to review a United Nations resolution dealing with the environment, not even to be reviewed by the Senate. So this is moving along quite quickly. So. And like I say, it's hard to get the attention of a lot of people because they, well, didn't bother me any. I don't have anything to worry about. That's up in Alaska, and nobody's knocking on my doors. But that's why those who are vigilant about one's liberty are the ones who are really the defenders and the keepers of the liberty. And it will always be a smaller number. It will never be, the vast majority. The vast majority usually go with the vocal minority that knows what they're talking about. And unfortunately, too often in this country in the last 100 years, the large majority has been going with the vocal minority that didn't know what they were talking about. So we would like to change that, and to me the most important thing to do to bring about positive change and to alert people is to educate people and bring it to their attention. And that is why your group, the Utah Get Us Out of the United Nations group, has to receive tremendous compliment for this, because this is the vehicle. This is the way it has to be done and should be done, whether it's getting out of the United Nations or whatever, or whether it's making sure that we in the Congress obey our oaths and only go to war when the Congress declares war. Whatever the issue is, it has to be through the grassroots, and the grassroots will be energized when a small nucleus of people get busy and do it. So this should be very encouraging, and I like what I see, what is happening here. But the United Nations came into effect after World War II, and it was a follow-up from the failure of the League of Nations. And I deal a lot in economics. One of the strongest motivating factors for me to run in the early 70s was the economy and the financial system, and the breakdown of the Bretton Woods Agreement, which came out of the IMF and the United Nations. and the breakdown of the gold standard, and I've been very, very interested in that. But the economics and, of course, the politics and the power and the war, they're always connected. But my favorite economist, and I think the greatest of the 20th century, is von Mises, who wrote Human Action, who really understood the free market. But he spoke in Human Action about politics, and I want to read a short little statement he made dealing with the United Nations, and I think it has a great deal of meaning. He says, it is futile to place confidence in treaties, conferences, and such bureaucratic outfits as the League of Nations and the United Nations. Plenipotentiaries, office clerks, and experts make a poor show in fighting ideologies. The spirit of conquest cannot be smothered by red tape. What is needed is a radical change in ideology and economic policies. And that is so true, but it also represents so much what the founders believed. And staying out of entangling alliances. I mean, we were advised to do that, to stay away from that. Can you think of a more entangling alliance than this United Nations? I mean, so, you know, when I have difficult decisions to make, they become less difficult because I say, well, what does it say in the Constitution? You read it, and you usually can get some pretty good answers, and they're pretty clear. There aren't too many that are difficult. And it's the lack of respect for the Constitution that is such a burden. Not only do they not understand or don't respect, say, the war clause, the war powers of the Constitution. There was one time when I was on the Education Committee, I made the point that, you know, quite possibly what we're doing in education now, by federalizing it, isn't a constitutional function. And suggesting what they were doing was not proper under the Constitution. And the chairman said, maybe. He says, but that's not our job. He says, that's the job of the courts. Can you believe that? I mean, remember, the chairman of a committee, and I think he believed it. You know, like, we can do whatever we want, and we don't have responsibilities to read the Constitution. Well, what's the oath of office supposed to be about? So that's so you can't be surprised by what comes out of there. And, you know, another time this came up when we were dealing with campaign finance reform. You know, that wonderful piece of legislation to enhance your personal liberty. You know, when that was on the floor, our side knew it was bad. And they knew it would probably be passed, and our administration wanted it because they said it was a political plus. Oh yeah, we're going to be tough and we're going to clean this up. They didn't want to clean up government. They wanted to blame those of you and the people who come to Washington to petition their government and regulate the way you spend your money. And they said, but it's so bad that the courts will get rid of it. Lo and behold, the courts ruled 5-4 in favor of it. But there were so many of them who were willing to go along with it for political reasons, believing that our courts would protect us. Goes to show you, we can't even depend on our current court system to save us from what we're doing in Washington. But after World War II, of course, we had the IMF and we had the World Bank set up. The IMF is the financial arm of the world government, and they are still very much involved, and they deal in big bucks, mostly ours, and they interfere in currency markets and bailing out countries where at one time they used to prop up currencies, now they prop up economies, and it's a mixture of the IMF. A few years ago when we bailed out Mexico, it was a mixture of our money as well as money coming out of the IMF and international banking system. So that's been around a lot and very much involved, and it's very expensive. Now, the World Bank, I see that as the welfare arm of the government, of the world government, and they get these grants, and then they go over there and they build dams that aren't necessary and do all kinds of things that usually don't end up doing much good for anybody, but except for those special companies that might qualify for the contracts. And that's why big corporations, the big corporations who benefit by the huge contracts going through the World Bank and the shenanigans in the IMF are this very often the very same companies that are getting the contracts to both bomb countries and rebuild them. You know, just think of the billions of dollars we've just spent to destroy a country, and now we're going to spend billions of dollars rebuilding it, and we have jobs programs over there. You know, I don't believe in jobs programs here, but if you're going to have one, let's have one here before we have one in Iraq. Now, just a few years ago, they passed the WTO, which is the World Trade Organization. Now, that's just another example of world government, and that's the trade arm to regulate trade. Now, who's supposed to regulate trade under our Constitution? It's explicitly given to the Congress to regulate trade, and it would be done on a bilateral fashion. So we, again, cannot, under the law, transfer that authority to the President to negotiate these so-called treaties, which aren't treaties because they come back and they're passed by law. But you know, this fast-track stuff is just another example. And I look at tariffs as taxes. I happen to believe you ought to be able to spend your money the way you want. But I also happen to believe, I don't believe in world government, and I don't believe in the shenanigans that go along with the WTO, who pass out special favors and privileges to the rich corporation. So it'd be... So it'd be really very easy and beneficial to us to not have the WTO. But along with the WTO, there are other entangling type of trade organizations that go on all the time that aren't directly under the United Nations. And take, for instance, right now, the free trade areas of America. That's the big thing that's going on right now, and that'll be just expanding NAFTA. Some of the things that NAFTA wanted to do, at least their goals, weren't horrible. At the same time, the idea that we are unifying governments together and putting 3 governments together and now 10 or 15 together, and they're coming together in Europe, and then we have this umbrella, the United Nations, I do not see for a minute how that's going to enhance why I work in politics, and that is the enhancement of liberty. That won't help us. And therefore, it is the elimination of and the prevention of big government is the most necessary thing that we can do if we care about individual liberty. You know, today at the State House, I was asked the question about how to curtail some of these regulations by the regulatory agencies. You know, Congress reneges on its responsibility. They write a law, set up an agency, then the agency just writes the rules, and these rules are the law of the land. So we've allowed that to happen. That's in the executive branch, but there's another area in the executive branch that we really lose a lot, and it's been going on for a long time and continues to go on regardless of party, and that's the executive order. I think we should do away with that executive order stuff. You know, the press aide for Clinton let the cat out of the bag when he said, a stroke of the pen, law of the land, kind of cool. That's their attitude. You know, they just know how much power there is in just writing an executive order, and they're done wholesale. There are a few executive orders in the Constitution. If a president, if his war is declared and he executes an executive order to pursue that war, that's a lot different than what we're talking about, where if the Congress won't be doing something fast enough, a president just writes an executive order. So it's done pretty routinely. But we do face some very, very serious challenges. This is not going to go away. I imagine in Washington, because they have the upper hand and they know how to undermine our efforts, and by the time it gets to conference they can change things, that on the short run we may see things getting worse. I also am convinced that the economy is going to get worse. And the reason I argue this case is that I believe our country is a lot poorer than we think we are, because we have a lot of wealth in the country, and we still are very wealthy, and we are still very fortunate. Our greatest wealth is that we can still have a meeting like this and talk about it. That, to me, is our greatest wealth. But any one of us, if we can get a line of credit at the bank and go out and borrow $1 million, we can get a pretty fancy car and get a pretty fancy house and party for a good while. And on the surface, it would look like we're very rich. But if the bank calls the note, then all of a sudden we can be very poor. Well, a country doesn't operate quite like that, but the principle is still the same. Our country, borrows from overseas. We borrow $160 billion a year to finance our extravagance, and it goes into consumption. And the amount, the trillions of dollars that consumers have run up in debt is just astounding. Corporate debt is huge, and the federal debt is huge, and it's exploding right now. And the trust is still there with the dollar, because we are an economic, in spite of our problems, we're an economic powerhouse, and we have the military, so therefore our currency is relatively strong. But if you happen to have noticed in the last year, it's getting weaker and weaker by the day. So that tells us that the world is starting to discover that our currency is not going to hold up, and that when a currency goes down, it will weaken the country, because we will have higher cost of living, and we will also finally discover that, that the pension funds aren't as sound and secure. So Social Security has never been known to be all that secure, and the private pension funds are facing the same problems. So we as a country must face up to the fact that we are getting and will be much poorer. But then again, it may be an opportunity to present our case for limited government and sound money and individual liberty. And but all great nations and all empires do come to an end, sometimes by external force, but more likely they come to an end for economic reasons. And we lived in the 20th century through one of the greatest chapters of history that could be imagined, and that was to see the disintegration of the Soviet system. And that was something that Mises had predicted in 1912. He says it won't work, it can't work, socialism doesn't work, because they don't have a pricing structure and there's no market, and it won't work. It'll just limp along for a while through authoritarianism, but eventually it falls apart. And to me, the amazing thing was that it fell apart with so little violence. And I think that's wonderful. So although we're complaining and worrying, and we should, about the accumulation of government power in the United Nations, think how many more new countries there have been since the collapse of the Soviet system. But unfortunately, they are being gobbled up by our troops going in there, as well as NATO moving in there, and the United Nations is still there. It's not so much of the total disintegration and elimination of a big government, which we have had with the elimination of the Soviet Union, but it's just being transferred to someone else. But systems do come down for economic reasons, and I think we're not going to be able to afford what we have. I think the welfare, warfare state will come to an end in due time. How long? I don't know. 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. It really depends on the trust of foreign people to trust our money and to keep investing in our profligacy and our spending. And that might, and the dangerous part is that trust can end quickly. It can end in minutes, days, months, or it could go on for years, because it's sort of a subjective thing. And a lot of people say, well, how can the euro be doing so well? That currency isn't any better than the dollar, and that's true. And if the euro is doing a lot better than the dollar, and it doesn't have a better history, and it has no sound backing to it, and the economies of Germany and France and other European countries are actually weaker than ours, and their currencies are going up against ours, that should make you stop and wonder. And that's what's happening. But ultimately, the system will have to withdraw. We will have to draw in, and we won't be able to spend it. And eventually, in all societies that resorted to inflation and coin clipping and paper money and fiat money, the system ends, and there's a resort to go back to something of real value, something one can trust, and that is, under the Constitution, it should be gold or silver. Which means that we have a few other things that we need to repeal. We're going to repeal the 16th and get rid of the IRS, so in the meantime, as we do that, we'll repeal and get rid of the Federal Reserve System. One of my favorite of the founders is Samuel Adams. And Samuel Adams has given us some advice I think is very, very pertinent. He says it does not take a majority to prevail, but rather an irate, tireless minority, keen on setting brushfires of freedom in the minds of men. Isn't that great? And this is what I see happening here and other places in the country. At the grassroots levels, there are some brush fires starting to burn. The good kind of brush fire, the ones that we want to burn and to spread, because it's these brush fires of freedom that will make a difference. And they do not depend on the government. They depend on one thing, and that means it depends on us being moral people with ideas and determination that it's in our best interest to live in a free and prosperous society and live with the rule of law and live with our Constitution. That's the brush fire I support, and that's the brush fire I come to encourage. So go to it. Thank you very much.